One. My guest today is Liah Greenfeld, who I hope I said that right, who has written several books on the topic of nationalism. And I always begin with in the intro of the podcast is how did you get interested in nationalism as a field of study?
I lived in a number of countries for long periods of time. And when I came to the United States at the age of 28, I noticed a great difference from the conception of nationalism in the other countries I lived in. But I also started to work on the concept of charisma in Weber, and this somehow led me to German nationalism.
Mm.
And and so I started reading about German nationalism, and then realized that it was a very peculiar kind of nationalism, very different, for example, from French nationalism and very different from American nationalism. And so I became interested. I thought, like most people do think at that time, that nationalism is everywhere the same, that there is a uniform phenomenon, kind of natural to humanity, and it is everywhere the same. And I discovered that it was not at all the same. And so I decided to do a comparative study. And this led to my first book on nationalism, Five Roads to Modernity.
And you actually said this because I think many like me think that it's an ideology. You said this before the recording, which was honestly quite surprising to me. So, but it's not an ideology. So, what is nationalism exactly? Because if it's not an ideology, what is it?
Nationalism is primarily, in the first place, a form of consciousness. This is the way in which we imagine reality, and which, as a result of that, we use to construct reality. So you can say that this is the nationalism is the cultural framework of modernity, of modern society. All of us are, in fact, nationalists, whether we are aware of that or not. We are all nationalists because this is the lens through which we see reality. Now, as a form of consciousness, nationalism is very different from other forms of consciousness. For example, it is very different from the religious form of consciousness that it replaced. In the religious form of consciousness, the focus of our thinking, of our feeling, of our existential experience was transcendental. The most important things for us were out of this world. They were not secular. It was God and our relationship with God, and the eternal life, whether good or very bad, after death in this world. Nationalism moved our focus onto this world. So it is a fundamentally secular form of consciousness.
Is there a difference between patriotism and nationalism?
No, there is absolutely no difference between patriotism and nationalism. Usually, we call our own nationalism patriotism, and we call the patriotism of other people, especially those with whom we disagree, we call it nationalism. You see, but no, in fact, there is not much difference. One should understand that nationalism really much broader concept than patriotism, because patriotism really implies specifically the nationalist sentiment, sentiment of the love of one's nation. But nationalism is much broader. It implies not only the sentiment, the emotion, but it implies the very mode of thinking, the very image of reality, of which patriotism is a reflection. And what is this image of reality? This image of reality is that this world is meaningful in its own right and is the source of law and values. Not God is the source of law and values, but this world. And this world is naturally divided. This is the image of nationalism. This world is naturally divided into sovereign communities of equal members, which is called nations. You see?
Yeah.
Now, when you think that those are sovereign communities of equal members, you understand that nationalism presupposes democracy. Nationalism is the very basis of our democratic values, our democratic institutions, and our democratic societies. So, yes, you want to ask something else?
No, keep going.
So before nationalism emerged in the 16th century.
So that's what I wanted to ask you about, because as history if you ever read a history book before the 16th century, like you said, historians love to point out that the idea of a country and nationalism wasn't a thing until the 16th century. So what was, like you were about to explain, what was it like before nationalism? How did you feel?
Yeah.
Like,
So
did it hold on 1 second there. So did it matter which empire you belonged to, or didn't it matter at all if you belonged to let's say the Holy Roman Empire, to France or Germany or Italy, whichever empire? It just didn't matter if you were a peasant, or what was it like?
No, of course it didn't matter much, because you see, what mattered was how you behaved in regard to your God, because the most important considerations was whether you're going to heaven or to hell after you die. This life altogether was not very important. What was important is the preparation for the afterlife. You see, so it really didn't matter. One's identity was the identity of a Christian, and I'm talking about that society where it was replaced by nationalism, which was England This happened at first in England. And so it was one's identity as a Christian and then one's identity within the society of orders. So because it was the societies were imagined as created by God's providence. And by God's providence, they were created in the form of three orders. The most powerful order was the order of nobility, which was basically a warrior order that whose function was to protect the Christian church. Then there was the order of clergy, and their function was to mediate between the mortals and God. And finally, there was a huge order, the majority of every society, which was the order of working people, peasants, and their function was basically to serve those two upper orders.
Yeah, I was reading somewhere, and I don't remember the book's name. I think it was The Age of Faith by Will Durant, but I don't remember. But when it came to the peasants, let's say in England, it didn't matter. It wasn't like England, the country. It just mattered if you were from Nottingham, for example. You were, as far as they were concerned, they were from Nottingham. They didn't belong to England, the country, or Great Britain, if that was a thing. They was just that they are from the city of Nottingham, you are from the city of Manchester, that's where you belong. It's not like I'm from England, that country, that didn't exist.
Yes, you're absolutely right. This is how it was. And those orders, they were mutually exclusive. That is, especially the order of the nobility and the order of the peasants. You couldn't move from one to the other. They were like different species, like different animal species. And it was believed that even they differed in the very nature of their blood. So they couldn't mix at all. The blood of the nobility was blue, it was believed so, and the blood of the peasantry was red. So it wasn't possible to, let's say, be born a peasant. It was inconceivable. To be born a peasant and then rise to the order of the nobility was as inconceivable as to be born a chicken and then rise to become a horse. You see? It was completely inconceivable. So, of course, there was no conception of equality between those different strata. And they had completely different rights. Their lives had completely different value. You understand?
Yeah. A serf was born to be a serf, and a noble was born to rule.
Exactly, this is how it was. And obviously, the entire community was not sovereign. Only the king was sovereign. The first among nobles was sovereign. And this sovereignty was God-given. So the desires of the majority, their interests, clearly had no meaning and no importance. And this became very different when nationalism replaced this feudal and religious consciousness. So we owe our values of equality, of individual freedom, which is very much connected to equality, and of popular sovereignty. We owe all those values to nationalism. Now, to this, the emergence of this form of consciousness. Now, why did it emerge? It emerged in England because of an historical accident. And the historical accident was the Wars of the Roses in the later half of the 15th century. During those very protracted conflict, several decades, the nobility, the feudal aristocracy of England that ruled the country before that, including the royal family of Plantagenets, were physically destroyed. So what happened was that a new dynasty, very flimsily related to Plantagenets, the Tudors, came to power, and they needed an aristocracy to rule. But there was no aristocracy physically. They were exterminated. So there started a period, a very protracted period of upward mobility from the red-blooded people to the aristocracy, which was supposed to be blue-blooded. So those red-blooded people who became new aristocrats, they knew that their blood was red. And they knew that they occupied now positions which only the blue-blooded people could occupy. So it was a very good experience for them, but it made no sense. And they had to rationalize it. That is, to make it both make sense and legitimate. Understand? And it was because of this need to rationalize this extraordinary experience, extraordinary and within the previous consciousness, inconceivable experience of upward mobility, that the concept of the nation emerged.
How quickly did this spread throughout the lands? How quickly did it develop?
Well, first of all, let's understand what actually happened. The word people at that time, and all those new aristocrats were members of the people. The word people at that time meant plebs, rebel, you know, the scum of the earth, the lower classes. Nobody respected them. They were not an object of respect. And the word nation at that time meant an elite, a very tiny elite of representatives of cultural and political authority. You see?
Yeah.
So what happened? Somehow the two concepts were combined. And somebody in the very beginning of the 16th century, one of those new aristocrats, trying to explain to himself his own and his peers' extraordinary experience, concluded that the English people is a nation. So equated, you know, the concept of people and nation, and symbolically elevated the rebel to the position and dignity of the elite. Understand?
Mm-hmm.
And this is why nationalism. This is a redefinition of the people, common people, as the elite.
Right.
Those who decide on the cultural and political values of the community. And this is how we have this idea of the nation as a sovereign community of fundamentally equal members.
When you first heard the term nationalist, that as a term, when does the word first start to be used?
The word started to be used later, but the word nation, the concept of the nation, was first defined in the first so-called Renaissance English-Latin dictionary, the Dictionary of Thomas Eliot, published in 1538. So this is the first time we have this complete redefinition of those concepts and the appearance of the modern concept of nation and the modern concept of people, and with this, the modern concept of country and of patriotism and, you know, all the related things that we are talking about when we talk about nationalism.
Mm.
Now, nationalism is simply the collective noun referring to thinking related to this vision of the nation, to thinking, to feeling, to behavior related to this concept of the nation, this vision of the nation.
Right.
And it first appeared when nationalism moved to France, when it was imported into France.
How did that happen? When did we see that nationalism imported from
well, you see,
England to the rest of Europe?
England was the only nation in the world for about 2 centuries, from the 16th to the 18th centuries. But the English, whose consciousness this was, they believed that the entire world is composed of nations because this was their consciousness. Now, because of nationalism, and this is what I describe in my second book of the trilogy, The Spirit of Capitalism, Nationalism and Economic Growth, because of nationalism, which is a very competitive consciousness, you see, because people connect their dignity. Nationalism implies dignity of individual identity. If a member of a community is equal to all the other members of the community, including the most powerful, right? Then this is a very dignified identity. And this distinguishes national identity from all the other identities, from identities within every other form of consciousness. So because their own dignity derives from membership in the nation, nationals, that is members of the nation, become naturally and exceptionally strongly committed to the dignity of the nation as a whole. So they become very strongly committed to the international prestige, the standing of their community, among others. So, having acquired national consciousness, the English became extremely competitive. And as a result, very quickly, from a backward, poor, relatively unimportant country vis-a-vis its continental neighbors, such as France, Spain, etc., they skyrocketed in prestige and became the most powerful country, economically, militarily, and culturally.
But doesn't nationalism, and this might be a stupid question, but doesn't nationalism kind of go against colonialism in a sense? Because if England believe that everyone is national, and they say when they occupied India, shouldn't they feel? Isn't that kind of going against nationalism in a sense, colonialism? If it says
They were extremely competitive. You see, they were extremely competitive, and they believed that all the others were competing against them. You see.
Mm-hmm.
So they wanted to be superior to all the others so that those others would not outcompete them. It's not that they respected anyone's, it was the desire for their own dignity. And
right.
Now, so the very interesting thing is that then everyone started, because suddenly the position of England vis-a-vis all the others changed. Everyone started imitating England. And so, throughout the 18th century, nationalism started spreading, first of all, to France, because they wanted to understand why England is suddenly so powerful, and they understood that it is connected to nationalism. And understand?
Yeah.
And it was the French, who invented the term nationalism. And they very explicitly told themselves, we have to have nationalism. We also have to have nationalism. At the same time, nationalism also spread to Russia. So those two countries were second nations in the world. England was first, those two were second. At the same time, the English were spreading around the world, you know?
Yeah.
This kind of leads to your question about colonialism, but the most important colonialism was settling in the North America, right?
Yeah.
So with them, they were bringing their consciousness. And so the United States of America was also one of the second nations in the world. So nationalism spread to the United States. Nationalism emerged with the American nation. So this is the only nation that is purely nationalist. It didn't have any pre-national existence. So it emerged as a nation with this kind of consciousness.
Is it because of the nationalism that we had the French Revolution in the first place?
Say it again.
Would the French Revolution have happened if it wasn't because nationalism didn't exist?
Yes, yes. French Revolution was an expression of French nationalism. It was the first self-affirmation of France as a nation. Yes, it wouldn't have happened if nationalism did not grow in France. The same is true about Russia. The Russian Revolution was also an expression of Russian nationalism, only it took much longer there than it did in France because of the different structure of society. So the English, you see, were carrying their consciousness naturally. everywhere where they went. So when they went to India, they went there only as they didn't conquer India like the Muslims did. They simply established their small commercial presence. But wherever they went, they brought their consciousness. And so it is because of this English colonialism that nationalism spread to countries such as India. And that the Indians then felt, you see, they became nationalists. And so they felt that it was undignified for them not to be sovereign.
Right.
Now, they didn't feel this way for 1,000 years while the Muslims ruled over them. They only began feeling that way when the English brought their consciousness and they were exposed to nationalism. And the English, from then on, of course, they couldn't think any other way, just like we cannot think any other way, because this was their consciousness.
Right.
And so they were with them, with the British Empire, the idea of democracy was spreading all around the world. And then when France became a nation with the French Revolution, very explicitly, they were spreading the message of nationalism. That is liberty, equality, fraternity. This is the message of nationalism. They were spreading it all around Europe and, of course, immediately eliciting an anti-French nationalistic reaction. Understand?
Yeah, well, absolutely,
So the very spread of this consciousness by English penetration all over and by French force of arms in Europe led to the growth of nationalism in those places and to anti-Western, anti-colonial, national liberation feelings all over the world. All those feelings did not exist before.
So when do we get the term kind of like, pan-Arabism, like you're an Arab, you feel like your country should be unified? When does the term pan, kind of, if you understand what I mean, come into the picture? Like pan-Scandinavianism, like if I wanted my Scandinavia as one country, I would be pan-Scandinavianism or pan-African, etc.
There were parts of the world that were only very artificially divided into administrative units and or chiefdoms, for example, at the time when nationalism was already a force. So you're speaking about 19th century already, right?
Yeah.
So at that time, the Arab world, all of it, while they had their specific chieftains' families, you know, their sheikhs and things like that. They were not sovereign. None of them had any sovereignty. They were under the rule of the Ottoman Empire, the Turkish Empire.
Yeah.
The Turks, you know, are not Arabs. They're Muslims, but they're not Arabs. And they ruled for about 5 centuries. They ruled the Arabs. And no Arab had any problem with that. No chieftain, no sheikh. It was okay. You know, this was a feudal system, and this is how things were. And then there was the First World War, and the Ottoman Empire was overturned, and the English and the French brought nationalism to the Middle East. They also divided, artificially divided, the Middle East into separate states that have no history, that didn't exist before. States such as Syria and Iraq and, you know, all of those, Jordan, and there were no such things under the Ottomans.
Right. There was just one empire,
There was just one empire. And so the nationalists, the first nationalists, intellectuals among the Arabs, who were first to be exposed to national consciousness and acquire it, they at first did not know what is the subject of their consciousness. You see?
Yeah.
What is their nation? Whether it is all the people who speak Arabic. This would be pan-Arab. Understand?
Yeah.
Or whether it is just that particular state, Iraq, that was created yesterday by the British.
Yeah.
Yes.
I got you.
So this is how it is. In fact, the beginning of Arab nationalism was pan-Arab. They wanted at first, Emir Faisal, for example, was promised by the British the creation of a pan-Arab state ruled from Damascus by him. You see, so they were pan-Arabists. But then, because of the conflict between Britain and France, you see, it so happened that France got the possession of Syria and not the British who made this promise to Faisal. They didn't want Faisal in their Syria, you know, and so this didn't come to be, the pan-Arab situation. And then they started developing their specific nationalisms. But even until now, it's not very well developed national consciousness in that area. Now, Scandinavia, I know very little about Scandinavia, but what I know is that
there was a Scandinavian movement. That's kind of what I was referring to in the 19th century, where people tried to unify Scandinavia, and they were pretty close, and that's what I was referring to as pan-Scandinavism. So that's what I was referring to.
So what I know is that Norway is a very recent creation, that it was a part of Denmark, and they decided this language, they speak basically the same language. And but at a certain, you know, period in the 19th century, kind of late in the 19th century, they decided to separate.
Mhm.
The main kingdoms were Sweden and Denmark, right?
Yeah, Sweden, Norway
Ah.
was the
Yeah.
was the country. Yeah, or
Yes.
kingdom, if you will.
Yes. So this is a recent development. This is one of the later European nationalisms, and this is all a result of the spread of the national consciousness, through the European continent. A very large influence, of course, was the influence of the huge Russian Empire, which was one of the second nations and very nationalistic throughout the 18th and the
Right.
19th centuries. And with, of course, there was this influence on the other northern countries.
So when this brings us to Germany and nationalism and Hitler. How did he embrace nationalism, and how did he use nationalism in his fascist party and the fascist movement?
The one thing that must be always remembered is that Hitler was not a fascist. This is a mistake. Hitler was a Nazi. National Socialism, Nazi means National Socialism. National Socialism is different from fascism. Now, the thing is, as you remember probably, there was a Soviet-Nazi pact before Hitler broke it and attacked the Soviet Union.
Right.
And it was because of this pact that the Soviets, that is, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republic, USSR, right?
Mm-hmm.
The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, did not want to use the sobriquet National Socialism when Hitler attacked, before the pact and after the pact. You see, they didn't want to have another socialism and its enemy. So before the pact, that is because before 1939, they started using the term fascism in regard to German National Socialism.
Right.
Then the interesting thing, during the pact, they reverted back to National Socialism because now they were friends. And then when the war with the Soviet Union started, then they went back to fascism, calling the Germans fascists.
So that's where we think that they are fascists. That's where it comes from.
This is where it comes from, and from the fact that all the left in the West took their cue from the Soviet Union. So we call them fascists. They're not fascists. Now, this goes back to the types of nationalism. The thing is that the biggest, most important difference between fascism and National Socialism is that fascism is not racist. While National Socialism is a paradigmatic form of racism. And this reflects the different types of nationalism. Now, those types developed in this sequence. English and then British and then American, so that English derived nationalism, the original nationalism, was defining the nation as an association of free and equal individuals, because the source of this original nationalism was the experience of individuals.
Right.
So this was an individualistic nationalism. Okay?
Yeah.
When, so for example, in English and in American English, until now, the words nation and people correspond to collective pronouns. You know,
Okay. Yeah.
like in the preamble to the American Declaration,
Mm-hmm.
like, we the people.
Yeah.
When nationalism was imported into societies like France or Russia and the others who didn't have the experience of individuals underlying its importation,
Yeah.
the concept of nation became singular. The concept of nation and the people became a singular noun. And it referred now to the nation and the people as a collective individual,
Mm-hmm.
as a collective individual with its own will and its own interests, independent of the wills and interests of the human individuals who were composing it.
Yeah.
So it developed as a collectivistic nationalism. So in England, Britain, the United States, all those individualistic nations, Australia, all the nations in the so-called Anglo world, nationalism led to institutions of liberal democracy, majoritarian democracy, where the majority of individuals decided on everything, institutions that safeguarded individual rights in the first place, where nationalism developed as a collectivistic nationalism, there always was a very strong authoritarian tendency, and the democracy developed institutions, democratic institutions developed as those of authoritarian democracy, with a certain political elite divining the will, the general will, you know,
Yeah.
and the interests of the nation, irrespective of what the majority of the individuals thought. So you have first individualistic nationalism and collectivistic nationalism.
I think you pretty much. Sorry. Yeah. Go on.
Now, individualistic nationalism logically defines criteria of membership in the nation, that is nationality, on a voluntaristic basis. One's national identity cannot be imposed on an individual, but should be voluntarily assumed, freely chosen, and can be abandoned. So, as a result, for example, anyone can become an American, a member of the nation, acquire American nationality.
Right.
And one can also lose American nationality. If one doesn't want to be American, here I go, goodbye, and that's it.
Now, I think you pretty much answered this question already, but I'm gonna ask it anyway. What is nationalism dangerous, or is it just misunderstood because of history has interpreted it the wrong way? Is it as dangerous? Right. Is nationalism misunderstood in today's society, or is it as dangerous as some people make it out to believe it is?
Well, let me first finish what I am telling you. So you have the type of individualistic and civic nationalism, as in the Anglo world, where nationality is equated with citizenship. You see?
Mm-hmm.
In collectivistic, and this is a necessary equation because it is voluntary. Membership in the nation is voluntary. But in collectivistic nationalisms, there are two possibilities. It can be voluntary, that is civic, as it developed in France, for example.
Right.
That is, even though France is a collectivistic nation, and the nation is defined as a collective individual, if you really want to become French, that is, if you adore France and the French language and the French traditions, you're welcome. France is a completely civic nation. From the very beginning, it was very open. But a collectivistic nationalism can also be ethnic. That is, when membership in the nation is not voluntary, but is presumed to be transmitted by blood. That is, you are either born a member of a certain nation, and then you cannot lose it, or you are not born a member of a certain nation, and then you cannot become a member of this nation. Which way the collectivistic nationalism takes depends on the cultural achievements and the prestige of the community at the time when nationalism develops. So France was admired by the entire world when its nationalism was developing. They had a very well-developed sense of cultural superiority.
Right.
And they understood that everyone would want to become French. So whoever wanted, okay, they say, come on in. But countries such as Russia and Germany, when their nationalism was developing, had a deep sense of cultural inferiority. They didn't have anything to be proud of. Not their political system, not their language, not their culture. They didn't have literature, they didn't have anything. So, how could they then become a nation? And a nation with a dignity? How could they acquire a dignified national identity?
Yeah.
When they said, well, our virtues you cannot see, unlike the French virtues, for example, which are all external. Our virtues are natural. They're a reflection of our blood and soil.
Yeah.
And so the concept of ethnicity emerged, which is basically the concept of race. And both Russia and Germany developed collectivistic ethnic nationalism. Now, fascism is an expression of collectivistic civic nationalism, because this is what both Italy and Spain developed. Those are movements of Italy and Spain. And they had a very considerable sense of cultural superiority because of their connection, because of their history in general. In Italy, because of their connection to the Roman Empire, that was a very big thing to be proud of. And in
Did the
Spain,
Romans have a form of nationalism?
no, they had none. They had none, but of course, nationalists immediately start looking into history for the contents of their nationalism.
Right.
They project their nationalism into history. Romans had no nationalism, absolutely none. But Italians who lived there where Rome was, this is how they understand themselves. So they were very superior. And the same Spain. Spain was, of course, a very great power for a long time before nationalism. So they also didn't have any sense of inferiority, both in Italy and in Spain. Nationalism was collectivistic but civic. And of course, the horror of Nazism, of National Socialism, was its racism. So it is a bad mistake to confuse fascism with National Socialism.
Did the Nazis ruin the reputation of nationalism in a way that they made it a bad reputation?
They did. Yes, they did. They gave it a very bad name.
So is that why we think that a lot of people think that nationalism, you immediately have to be, if I said that I'm not that I'm saying I am, but like if I said I was a nationalist, then they immediately think, oh, you must be a racist because you're a nationalist and you are a far rightist or whatever group you belong to, but that is not good to say that I'm a nationalist in today's society.
That's right. Exactly as you say. Now, so the answer to that is that nationalism is the very basis of democracy. And we are all nationalists because we all share national consciousness and nationalist image of reality. We are all nationalists, but it is important to remember that nationalism comes in three types. individualistic civic, collectivistic civic, and collectivistic ethnic. And it is only collectivistic ethnic, such as in Germany and in Russia. That is both National Socialism and international socialism.
Right.
Only those are racist.
So I want to ask you, I think, what was your view on nationalism before you started going to studying nationalism yourself?
Well, my view was the view of everyone else. You know, it was precisely like you just described. Only at that time, one didn't speak a lot about nationalism because this was before the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and for about 40 years after the Second World War, that is when Nazism gave nationalism a really bad name, nobody dealt with nationalism.
Right.
And it was not at all a subject of academic discussion. People didn't talk about that. But I was born in Russia. I grew up in Russia. So I came with a very different view, you know.
Mm-hmm.
There, Russia, for example, was divided into nations. It wasn't, the Soviet Union was divided into nations and nationalities. And one's nationality was written in one's passport. It was purely a matter of biological heredity. You see?
Right.
One couldn't change it. And so, when I arrived in the United States, I saw how very different this was. It was a great surprise to me that in the United States, nationality was not a matter of blood, that it was a matter of citizenship, which one could acquire and lose.
Mm-hmm.
So I became very interested, you know, when I saw this different, completely different conception. So a comparative perspective is very necessary. It is essential for the understanding of those issues. To be a nationalist today is like to be a human, you know. One is a nationalist today. This is the consciousness we all share.
Right.
And it doesn't make one right-wing. And racism is not a matter of right or left-wing because, as I point to you with the examples of National Socialism in Germany and the Soviet Union, it can be a characteristic of both right and left. It is just because the nationalism underlying it is of a certain type, of a racist type, which is called collectivistic and ethnic nationalism. Lots of people on the left are in fact racists because their nationalism is of a collectivistic and ethnic type.
Right.
So one can think, for example, about lots of people in the United States, you know, who represent different ethnic groups or racial groups, racial groups, and they're racist by definition, because they derive one's identity, they consider one's identity determined by blood, and derive one's identity from natural heredity.
Right.
And many of those people would place themselves on the left and not on the right.
Right. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It's been a pleasure to talk to you and learn about nationalism today. And before we go, do you have anything you wish to promote? Any social media where people might find you if they have questions?
Well, they could, if they do have questions, they can write to me. They will find me on Google without any difficulty. So, and they will find my books also on Google. And I would welcome their reaching out to me and asking their questions. I would certainly welcome to continue the conversation with your audience. Thank you, Erlend.
Before you go, please like, share, and subscribe to this podcast. We are available on Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Spotify, wherever you can find podcasts these days. Please consider, if you are on iTunes, to write a little review and leave us 5 stars if you wish, if you really like the podcast. Please like, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.